Hello, I'm very happy to be able to present you some neuroscientific results on the plasticity of compassion, so how compassion training actually changes our brain. And before I will talk to you about the data and our study and what we did, I would like to take the time to briefly reflect on what it actually means that we can train our mind and we can train our emotions. Usually, when I think of myself as a certain person. I may think of myself as an anxious person or as a sad person or as an angry person. And I may think of myself as responding to situations in a certain way. So for instance, I'm afraid of many dogs, so if you told me that there would be a dog coming up, I would think I'll probably react with fear. But it may be that our emotional response to certain situations is not set in stone and that we can change the way we respond to certain situations. We can change the way we respond to the suffering of others, we respond to other triggers. So this is what our main question was. And so my talk is on the neuroscience of empathy and compassion. And Tanja Singer is the person I'm working with at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig. She cannot be here today, but she says hello to all of you. So Tanja and I were both interested in the plasticity of the social brain. We were interested in the question, can we train empathy? Can we train compassion? And how does it affect us? How does it affect us on the level of the brain? How does it affect us on the level of our feelings? And how does it affect us on the level of our behavior? And this question was really important to us because on an everyday basis, we are faced with the suffering of other people. So we're faced with the suffering of our friend who's sad because of a broken heart, and maybe we're a medic working in a hospital and we're faced with dying patients or people who are in great pain, or we just go to work and we see this homeless person on the street. So the suffering of other people and our own suffering are really inevitable in our lives. And when we meet these situations with empathy, it can go into two different pathways. And before I talk about the pathways, let us briefly re-reflect about the definition of empathy. So empathy is sharing another person's emotion. So if you are sad, I'm sad if I empathize with you. If you're happy, I'm happy when I empathize with you. But I know when I'm empathetic that it's not my primary emotion. I know that you are the source of my feelings. I know that I'm happy because you are happy. So this self-other distinction is very crucial for empathy. Now, when we meet the suffering of other people, as I said, it can go into two different arms. It can go down the compassion path, it can go down the empathic distress or personal distress part. So in the compassion part, we heard a lot of definitions on compassion today, but I will just briefly repeat it. Compassion is an emotion of concern for the suffering of another person, very closely linked to the motivation to alleviate the suffering, to help the other person. So this pro-social component is this pro-social motivation is very strongly linked to compassion. On the other hand, when we are faced with the suffering of another person, we can go into personal distress. We can feel the suffering of this other person as if it was our own suffering. We can really identify with it and go into this negative emotion, this self-related emotion, which ultimately may lead us into withdrawal because we cannot cope with all this distress any longer. And we were interested in, can we actually transform empathy? Can we transform personal distress into compassion? How does that look like in the brain? How does it affect our behavior? And initially, when we started, there were no longitudinal studies out there. What was known from the neuroscientific perspective was that there's an empathy for pain network in the brain. And it was looked at in cross-sectional studies where you have this situation that there's one person lying in the scanner. This is a scanner, you cannot really see it, but there's one person lying in the scanner having their brain scanned, and this hand is looking out of the scanner. And there's another person sitting next to the scanner and having their hand on this touchpad as well. And with little errors that the person in the scanner can see, it's been indicated whether the person lying in the scanner will receive a painful stimulation next or the person sitting next to the scanner. So the person being scanned sees through these cues which person is going to get painful stimulation next, oneself or the other. And while this happens, brain activation can be measured. And what's really interesting that across many studies, and this is results from a meta-analysis on 94 participants, across many, many studies, repeatedly the same networks show up. Namely, when we have self-pain, we have a very extensive network that's here shown in green, and this network comprises regions like anterior insula, which is located roughly here in the front, sort of very inside the cortex. And the insular cortex is thought of as an interoceptive cortex, so everything that we feel inside our bodies is projected there. So the visual cortex, for instance, we have it in the back of our heads, that's very active when we see something, and the insular cortex is very active when we feel something. So that's activated when we feel pain ourselves. And there's another region of the brain that's also activated when we feel pain ourselves, and it's the middle cingulate cortex that I'll try to show you with the pointers here. And these two regions, they're also active when we see someone else receive painful stimulation. So there's a shared network for our own pain and other person's pain. So in a different way, we understand other people's pain by activating a network that represents the affective component of our own pain. So it's like this shared understanding, it's empathy for pain, it's reactivating the parts that represent our own affective experience of pain. This was known about empathy for pain, but how we can shape that through training and how compassion influences that was unknown. And in order to explore this question, Mathieu Ricard actually volunteered as a guinea pig and went into compassionate and non-compassionate states, and there were other guinea pigs as well, which I will not mention today because of the briefness of this talk. But when Mathieu Ricard went into compassionate and non-compassionate states, Tanja Singer and her colleagues in Maastricht, where this was done, realized that the brain activation is actually very different, and that when Mathieu Ricard is in a compassionate state, as opposed to an empathic distress state, there's activation in areas like ventral tegmental area and substantia nigra and striatum and globus pallidus. And these regions did not look very much like the empathy for pain network that we just saw. So there seems to be a difference. And in order to explore whether we can also find an effect of training onto people who are not experienced to 40 years of meditation, we did a study where we trained normal, meditation-naive participants aged 18 to 35. So the study design looked like this. We had a pre-measurement with a newly developed task that I will talk about in a second, and then we had a compassion training group which did a compassion training intervention, and we had a memory group that did a memory intervention. The memory group was very important because we had repeated measurements and also to control for the social effect of being trained in a group. And we measured these groups before the intervention and after the intervention. How did the intervention look like? So in order to cultivate compassion, we had a very proficient compassion teacher who has a lot of experience in teaching metta, loving kindness, and this person taught our participants to foster their emotions of friendliness and warmth by imagining an affiliative person, the benefactor. And I usually take my grandmother who raised me when I was a little child, and I think of my grandmother and I feel all the warmth that I received from her and all the friendliness, and it makes my heart just shine, and I want to share this love with everyone naturally. And then you take this and you can actually share this loving emotion with the person sitting in front of you, with the stranger on the street. And this is what people did in our training. So they had the whole day where they were sitting and meditating and walking and meditating, imagining different persons and cultivating these feelings of warmth, of love, of friendliness towards these people. After this one-day training, we had several evening sessions which participants attended, and we asked them to practice at home and on their way to work or wherever they could. The memory training that we did used the method of loci. So you take locations in a city. We did this in Zurich, but if we were in London, we could take the London Bridge or Big Ben, and you take these locations and you link them up with the words you have to memorize. So if we have the word heart, and we have the first location is the London Bridge, we imagine a huge heart sitting on top of London Bridge. And when we then mentally revisit this location, this image of this massive heart sitting on London Bridge comes back to our mind. So it's also in the mind, working a lot with mental images, but it's not an affect training, it's a cognitive training. Okay, so these were the trainings we did. What sort of measurement did we do? So in order to measure it, as Roger alluded to, I actually took these little video films from the Swiss television, so little snippets that were filmed all over the world in order to be delivered in the news. Or I took snippets from documentaries, like this one that we showed yesterday to the kids in the conference that shows a woman that's wounded after an earthquake. And people saw these little video snippets and rated afterwards how much empathy they felt, how much negative affect they felt, and how much positive affect they felt. And I brought to you 2 of these little video films. Let's see. We had high emotion films and low emotion films to control for them, but our main focus was on the high emotion films, and I would like to play this one to you. I played them without sound. So this is a little snippet of this film. And just to show you the low emotion films that just showed people in everyday situations. Whoops. Sorry. Okay. There's nothing much happening, nothing very emotional happening. So how did the emotional response of participants change due to the compassion training? What we saw is that compassion training, which is shown here in red, and memory training, which is shown here in blue, had very different effects on positive emotion ratings. So after compassion rating, positive emotions went up for both types of films. For low emotion films, where actually nothing much is happening, you just see people do their everyday thing, but also for high emotion films, which is very impressive because there's someone suffering in this film, and people know that this is real, but still they can have some positive emotions towards what's happening. And this was pretty impressive because our training was rather short term, it was roughly a week. On the other hand, when we looked at negative emotion ratings, nothing much changed, so people still realized that there's something negative happening in these high emotion films. People are suffering. So it's not like people were cold-blooded afterwards. They were not indifferent to what was happening. They could share this negative affect, but they still had this positive emotion on top of it. In terms of empathy ratings, we saw that empathy ratings increased for low emotion films, but not for high emotion films. Let us now look at the brain. What actually changed in the brain? We saw that on the above panel you have the changes in the compassion group as compared to the memory group in response to high emotion films. And we see activations in medial orbitofrontal cortex, here, ventral tegmental area, putamen, and pallidum. And these regions are usually active when we see our babies, like pictures of our babies, or when we see a person we're in love with, or when we receive positive stimuli, like when we taste chocolate or have anything really rewarding. So it's amazing that despite the fact that people see movies of others suffering, that they can augment activation in these areas that are related to positive affect and to love, even though we just did a rather short-term training. This was very encouraging for us. And we didn't only see this in this study, but in 2 other studies where we did compassion training with a total of 46 other participants. So it's very consistent, these activations, and we also see them in an expert meditator who we measured for 3 days over several sessions going into compassion states. So this is a very nice finding which indicates that actually compassion training can foster positive feelings and foster activations in neural systems that are related to love, affiliation, and which are normally found when we are faced with our loved ones. Okay, now in order to answer the question how compassion is actually different from personal distress and whether we can change these two and transform personal distress into compassion, we did another study. And in this other study, we had a group of participants first trained in empathy and only after another measurement train them in compassion and measure them a 3rd time with the videos that you just saw. So, how did the empathy intervention look like? What we did is we again asked the participants to do structurally, it was very similar to the compassion intervention, so participants would be sitting or walking and imagine a series of people. But instead of cultivating these feelings of love and warmth, they would imagine the pain of themselves or of others and really feel the other people's pain as if it was their own pain, really go into this shared pain. And they trained that for an entire day and for several evening sessions, like we did with the compassion group. And only after we measured them a second time, we did compassion training with them, and the memory group did the memory training, which I just described. So how did that change emotions? We saw that empathy training augmented empathy, as expected. So the blue lines show you the effects of empathy training, and the red lines show you the effect of compassion training. The green lines show what happened in the memory group, where nothing much happened. So empathy training increased empathy responses both to low and high emotion videos. Importantly, empathy training did not change positive affect, but compassion training did again. So even though people have been sensitized after this empathy training, they could then increase their positive emotions. And in terms of negative affect, we saw that empathy training increased negative affect for both low and high emotion videos, but compassion then brought it back to the baseline levels. So it could reverse the effect that empathy training had. It could bring it back to the normal levels that we had before. That was very nice. That was what happened in the feelings of people. What happened in the brain? And we saw that empathy training, here again in blue, increased activation in the empathy for pain network, in this shared network that I just described to you at the beginning of this talk. So activations in anterior insular and anterior middle cingulate cortex, this shared empathy for pain network that we saw again and again, these activations were open to plasticity. They increased after empathy training. And these regions are also very much linked to unpleasant emotions. So in cross-sectional studies, unpleasant ratings usually correlate with activations in anterior insula. So this is very interesting. Conversely, when we then trained compassion, we saw a very different network activated, which again comprised prefrontal parts very strongly and ventral striatum. And these two regions, again, are very crucial when we experience positive affect, when we experience loving feelings. So again, we could show compassion indeed can activate or can strengthen activation in brain structures that are linked to love. And it can do so even though participants previously have been sensitized, previously have augmented their negative feelings. And now, finally, before I wrap this talk up, I would just like to briefly mention that compassion not only does something to your brain and to your feelings, but also something to your behavior. We have this little game where people hunt for treasure and their door's falling and they're being blocked, and people can actually not only play with their own little Pac-Man, but there's another person who's hunting for a treasure at the same time, and people can use their keys in order to help the other. And we observed that compassion training, but not memory training, increased pro-social behavior in this little game. So to wrap it all up, compassion increases positive emotions, increases activations in brain areas linked to love, affiliation, and on the other hand, empathy training can increase negative feelings, activations in insula, anterior middle cingulate cortex, shared empathy for pain network. Compassion training also fosters pro-social motivation and can help to overcome the empathic distress that some people experience in their professions. And if you're interested in learning more about compassion, there was a workshop last year in Berlin that Tanya Singer organized, and there will be an ebook. Paul Gilbert was one of the co-writers of this ebook, where we have little videos, compassion training, protocols and everything assembled from this workshop. It's free for download. So this as a little bit of advertisement. And now I close this talk and thank you for your attention.